What's up, everybody? Welcome to Union Minded. I'm your host, Eric Pacheco, IBEW journeyman out of Local 26, and today I want to talk to you about race and the role that it has had within the labor movement. I want to start you off with a quote. Racism is part of our inheritance as Americans. Every city, every state, and every region of this country has its own deep history with racism, and so does the labor movement. This was said by Richard Trumka, president of the AFL-CIO. Rest in peace, brother. He said this on September 15, 2014. Racism is so American, it was written into the Constitution by slave owners. All men are created equal. Yeah, right. For 100 years, slavery was the law of the land. But thanks to abolitionists like John Brown, the movement to end slavery gained enough traction to spark the Civil War. This ended slavery, but not racism. 100 years of Jim Crow laws followed, and thanks to an increase in industrialization, so too did the growth of labor unions in the North. But let's talk about the South. We'll begin our tale in the South, where labor was free of charge and the conditions unimaginably harsh, and it's better known as slavery. But these workers were no pushovers, no sir. They were rebellious. There were rebellions that scared the daylights out of the master class. More laws got passed. These rebellions exposed the violence that was required to continue the practice of slavery to the public. 100 years of resistance, political organizing, and the bloodiest war of our nation's history is all it took to end slavery. As you can see, the master class was very rational. The defeated Confederacy continued to establish black codes in the South. They limited a black person's right to hold property, teach, preach, or travel. Those who didn't abide by the demands of landowners to work the fields were often murdered. It took federal troops occupying southern states, threatening the political rights of whites, for them to accept the free black people's right to participate in government. With the help of the Freedmen's Bureau, black freed men voted and established public schools. They established aid societies. They rebuilt roads and raised taxes to pay for it all. As the feds pulled out, however, white on black violence in the South returned, and the progress made eroded immediately. The 13th Amendment legalized slavery for incarcerated people, and in the South this was used to continue to threaten black people if they didn't work. The chain gang was a very real threat. By 1910, with federal protection gone, the planter class South once again became a powerful conservative voting bloc in Congress, one that blocked labor rights and social reforms. In the rest of the country, the Civil War economy was a boom to industrialization, acquisition, and accumulation. The most ruthless reaped the greatest rewards. Carnegie, Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, and Rockefeller monopolized whole industries. They openly bought off politicians so they could write the rules to favor their businesses. Now, this still goes on today. The second half of the 19th century saw an influx of immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Eastern Europe, and China. They were consigned to large, dangerous factories, and their wages fluctuated with recessions. This made them ripe for union organizing and radical ideas like the 40-hour work week and rising wages. Working conditions sucked, but business was exploding. With more people came more ideas, and unions began growing too. Skilled trade unionists came together to form the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. The AFL was overwhelmingly native-born white Protestant males in the 19th century. They made higher wages and did not want to organize unskilled Irish and Italian Catholic immigrants. Other unions, like the Knights of Labor, founded in 1869, wanted to organize all workers, skilled and unskilled, men and women, white and black, all within an industry. The Knights taught immigrants their rights as citizens. They built cooperatives, provided economic education, and promoted political reform. A Knights of Labor railroad strike became a turning point in the industrial conflict. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention at this point that the AFL's early tendency towards exclusivity for white native-born Protestant males in their organizing efforts caused a major delay and the lives of thousands in the labor conflict. The correct position is solidarity with all workers as the Knights understood. A Wildcat Strike in 1877 embraced 100,000 workers and riots ensued. However, in response to the Pittsburgh militia firing into a crowd killing several people, this Wildcat Strike organized by the Knights changed the way the oligarchs or owner class responded to the labor movement. Prior to this event, punishment for strikes was minimal. Post this event, the industrialists ramped up their violence and surveillance against the labor movement. What followed was a very wild and violent fight over the right of workers to a union, to demand higher wages and shorter workdays. The last 2 decades of the 19th century saw more than 6 million workers involved in 23,000 strikes. Violent battles in the coal fields of Colorado, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania between 1900 and 1925, major steel strikes, the Triangle Waist Shirt Factory fire that killed 146 girls and women in New York City in 1911. In 1912, 30,000 women marched in the Bread and Roses Parade. In the early 20th century, the army of industrial workers striking and fighting with predominantly white, although ethnically, religiously, and politically diverse, and this was about to change. In 1910, 90% of African Americans lived in the South. Mostly were sharecroppers in rural areas. With hostilities in Europe, the flow of white workers to the northern factories slowed to a trickle. Demand for products didn't slow. This gave unions more power to negotiate wages and conditions. Employers began to recruit black workers as a way to break up strikes. They were used as replacement workers, and about 500,000 migrated north between 1910 and 1920. What resulted were racial tensions raised between workers. Tensions grew to violent attacks between striking white workers and the black workers brought in to fill their positions. In St. Louis, in 1917, one such race riot sparked by 3,000 strikers ended in the death of between 100 and 200 black working people, and 6,000 were left homeless. A year later, 4 million soldiers returned home from World War I with no work. Unemployment and racial resentment spiked. In the Red Summer of 1919, 38 separate race riots occurred, all of them white mobs attacking blacks across the country. Hundreds died, and scores of black homes and businesses were destroyed. With World War I over, the business community honed its anti-union tactics. They smeared union leaders in the media, calling them Reds, communists. This would be like McCarthyism. They derided striking workers. They encouraged local and state militia to intimidate strikers. Seems like they always use military or the police or private security forces to break up working people whenever we demand something. It's rather amazing how it works out. They brought in tens of thousands of African American and Mexican Americans as strikebreakers. They pitted the black and brown workers against the white workers with taunts of good white jobs going to black and brown workers. This would foreshadow the big business playbook for decades to come. The Great Depression brought about massive joblessness. Under pressure from the public, Republicans passed the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931 and the Norris Laguardia Act of 1932. Davis-Bacon requires federal contractors to pay their workers the wages and benefits that prevail in a locality. Norris Laguardia made it illegal for companies to require workers to sign yellow dog contracts, promising not to join a union. 1932 saw a coalition of white ethnic union members, African American workers, and conservative Southern Democrats elect Roosevelt. His New Deal laid the framework for our current labor laws, employment standards, and social insurance programs, but due to the Southern Democrats, the work was flawed. Racism, in my opinion, is what led Southern Democrats to exclude African Americans in the South from benefiting from the gains of the New Deal that provided everyone else. The gains that the New Deal provided everyone else. Classism is what caused Southern Democrats to strip so many of the good ideas in the New Deal so that it excluded 80% of all workers. By contrast, the 1935 National Labor Relations Act or the Wagner Act, guaranteed all workers the right to join a union and bargain collectively. It created an oversight board, and with fair referees, union density tripled. In a decade, 35.4% of all wage and hour workers were in a union. The pendulum swings both ways, though, and with bad appointments of anti-union referees, it stopped working for working people. 1940 saw the U.S. once again gearing up for war. A. Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the biggest and the baddest black union in the country, was determined that African American workers would benefit from the expansion of the defense industry. In 1941, he threatened to march 50,000 black men to Washington to protest their exclusion from production jobs. As a result, Roosevelt banned discrimination in defense factories and even established a Fair Employment Commission to enforce his executive orders. But in June of '43, managers at the Packard Company in Detroit promoted a few black workers. This caused 25,000 white workers to go on strike. I would say race had something to do with that. That's one example of many racial conflicts that erupted nationwide when black workers gained access to production jobs. The Congress of Industrial Organization, the CIO leaders, among other labor leaders, worked hard to stifle the hate strikes. W.E.B. Du Bois, when writing about the ability of union solidarity to overcome racial animosity, said that union men in industry have been thrown together, black and white, as fellow workers striving for a common goal. Due to this, there has been an astonishing spread of interracial tolerance and understanding. It's possible that no movement in the last 30 years has been so successful in softening race prejudice in unions. The NAACP worked closely with the UAW to integrate Ford and sit down strikes at the River Road plant. As production jobs opened to the African Americans, the second half of the great migration of black workers exploded. The CIO broke away from the AFL in 1935. So they had a little bit of a partnership, but in 1935 they kind of went their separate ways. You got to keep in mind the CIO wanted to unite all workers, and the AFL had a little bit of exclusive thinking in the way they organized. The CIO was committed to a broader, more inclusive vision of organizing. The AFL was stuck in old ways of thinking. They were exclusive and were reluctant to organize black workers. 1946, the CIO launched a failed organizing attempt called Operation Dixie. The idea was that the anti-union South was hurting workers nationwide. Companies were heading south to avoid unions, and it failed due to Jim Crow laws in the South that were protected by Southern Democrats. With Congress now for sale, the Labor Management Act of 1947, Taft-Hartley, outlawed Wildcat strikes, mass picketing, and secondary boycott tactics used to win union recognition. These corporate congressmen passed right-to-work laws which allowed union members to gain representation without paying dues. Union organizing then stagnated. The following decade saw wages fall, union membership decline, and income inequality skyrocketed. The civil rights movement, gaining momentum, saw A. Philip Randolph and other civil rights leaders demand President Truman desegregate the military. He died in 1948. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled separate but equal was unconstitutional. Then came the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott and Rosa Parks. The AFL-CIO merged in '55. Hundreds of thousands of black trade unionists became part of an integrated labor movement. George Meany became its first president, with A. Philip Randolph as its first vice president. The Sleeping Car Porters and the UAW were among the first supporters of the new Southern Christian Leadership Conference led by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The AFL-CIO supported the actions taken in the fight for civil rights and helped plan, organize, and fund King's 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where the I Have a Dream speech was spoken. Thanks to A. Philip Randolph and other black trade unionists, the priorities and interests of the labor movement were linked with the demands of racial equality. Now we get to the 60s. In 1960, JFK realized that labor was crucial to him becoming president. He created a National Labor Relations Board that would be true to its original mission. Under Kennedy, the NLRB restricted anti-union propaganda, allowed picketing increased penalties for labor law violators, banned employer lockouts, ruled that if a majority of workers signed a card saying that they wanted to join a union, the union would be recognized. Kennedy established collective bargaining rights for federal employees in 1962. In 1960, only 2% of state and local public employees had the right to bargain collectively, but by 1990, more than 60% did. The rapid expansion of public sector unions has been a boon to both the labor movement and the growth of the black middle class. Kennedy got assassinated. Lyndon Johnson wins the '64 election in a landslide. This win comes with a veto-proof majority in both chambers of the Congress. His administration was responsible for outlawing employment discrimination, desegregating public accommodations, prohibiting poll taxes, prohibiting discrimination in housing, establishing Medicare, establishing Medicaid, establishing food stamps, a jobs corps, investing in poor schools and poor communities, farming communities. Public colleges got more investment, urban mass transit got investment, clean air, clean water, safety standards on cars, food safety. For labor, extended labor standards, improved Davis-Bacon, and increased the minimum wage. All of these were very good things. Somehow, some reason, labor density did not grow with all of these changes. The 60s were full of conflict and racial animus. Many white folks did not like the hippie war protesters or the demand for equality and pace of its implementation. While the end of the segregation was being fought for in the South, in the North, frustrations with de facto segregation in both education and housing, coupled with the ever-present police brutality, led to the increased levels of despair and activism for Northern African Americans. There were rises in new social movements, black liberation, black nationalism, and the women's movement. Lots of people demanding equal treatment. Yeah, the country was divided. Malcolm X's assassination in '65 left a crowd of suspicion around the government's involvement. Police violence led to the Watts riots later that year, which left 34 dead, mostly black. The long, hot summer of '67 gave rise to 159 urban disturbances in black neighborhoods related to violent encounters between white police and black residents in inner-city poor communities. More than 100 people died, and again, they were mostly black. Dr. King recognized the struggle for full equality and that good jobs were the key to black advancement. Dr. King strongly believed in unions as a way to achieve higher wages and economic opportunity. Dr. King was assassinated while speaking in support of the I Am a Man strike of black sanitation workers, AFS-CME members, in 1968. Hours after Dr. King's assassination, rioting erupted in 130 cities. 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy was killed. In August, 4 days of fighting between protesters and police at the Democratic Convention was witnessed by the nation. October, 100,000 white students marched against the war in Vietnam. During the Kennedy-Johnson years, labor fought alongside civil rights leaders for racial justice, labor rights, public investments in infrastructure and training, better retirement security, better access to college and health care, and anti-poverty initiatives. Both black and white poverty rates were cut by half, from 55% to 27% and from 20% to 10% respectively. In '68, George Wallace, a white supremacist, ran as a third-party candidate. He won 5 states, but Nixon won the election and declared a mandate. Starting with Nixon and up to today, conservative politicians wrote a new playbook. Use racial animus and activate racial fear while lifting up the white race as the silent majority, the real Americans, the people who play by the rules. They started displaying publicly empathy for the middle class, or working people, and propagandized them to instruct their political appointees to dismantle labor protections, restrict unions, support right-to-work laws, and undermine civil rights. Nixon called for law and order, a not-so-subtle promise to crack down on black demands for full equality. He spent his early term increasing police budgets for riot gear. I wonder why. He cut funding for small businesses, education, and training. You mean he cut anti-poverty legislation? By 1971, Nixon's NLRB had undone all of the progressive labor reforms done under Kennedy's NLRB. And that's what I mean by the NLRB being the referees that can tilt the field one way or the other. Carter won 48% of the white vote and 62% of the union vote in 1976. But instead of paying back labor with a recast NLRB, he chose to deregulate highly unionized trucking, airlines, and communications industries. By 1980, private union density fell to 20%. Reagan campaigned openly, promoting racial stereotypes in 1980, and as a result, he won 56% of the white vote. Only 45% of the union vote went towards Reagan. In 1981, he fired 11,000 air traffic controllers who had endorsed him and banned them for life from federal employment. With that, an onslaught was bestowed on working families. Unions were attacked, protections were eroded. Reagan, at the same time, gutted anti-poverty programs and the Civil Rights Commission. He appointed conservative Supreme Court justices. In 1984, Reagan wins 66% of the white vote, 46% of the union vote. We call those union voters hitchhikers because they hitchhiked the movement and still vote against our best interests. His presidency wreaks havoc on poor communities, black communities, labor gains and hurts working families. His trickle-down economic theory begins to really ramp up the erosion of the middle class. In summary, the struggle to gain shorter work days and better pay, to work under better conditions with dignity in the workplace, it was a bloody one. The struggle for racial justice has also been a bloody one. The largest gains in both racial justice and labor rights has been when labor stopped being exclusive and started being inclusive. When labor realized that human rights are labor rights, they joined with the fight for racial justice and were able to bring about positive change through a dynamic coalition. Moving forward, it's on us to promote equal opportunity, but this isn't a cure-all. When hard times arise, so do tensions. But through solidarity, as we work together for a common goal, as we talk to each other on jobs, we can begin to understand that our struggle is common between us. Every successful social reform movement in American history, including the labor movement, began when Americans stood up and fought together for a better future. United we stand. Solidarity always wins. I hope you guys found this informative. Sorry for all the mumbling. I've had this in my back pocket for a long time. I've wanted to do this video for a hot minute and I just never got around to it. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. The link to the article where I got all of my information will be in the description box, so you can look it up and read the article yourself. This was just kind of my summary. All right? Have a good one. Later.